It was January 2013, and I had just taken my first class in my first year of seminary at Emmanuel College here in Toronto. It was a class on the letters of St. Paul taught by Professor Dr. Leif Vogue, who would get so animated when he lectured, when he hit his rhetorical crescendo, his old yellow dog, who mostly just slept and farted under his desk, would start howling, as if they were tag teaming to make a crucial theological point. I'll always remember that first class. I was so fresh-faced and eager, my Bible still with that new Bible smell. I will remember that first class. And I will also remember what happened right after that first class. Exhilarated by the new spiritual adventure of seminary, and with my head full of Paul and my heart on fire for the Lord, I didn't want to leave the college that day to go back to the real world quite yet. I was still working full-time and had a baby at home with very different notions about sleep and personal hygiene than my wife and I. On that first day, I just wanted to sit in the glow for a bit longer. So after the class, I went to the student lounge on the third floor and sat down in one of the red squashy chairs. I didn't know anybody, so I just sat there and I looked around and I listened. And I did not mean for this to happen, but I couldn't help but hear the conversation of two students sitting at the table behind me. They were obviously further along in their training and were already in some form of ministry. I don't know which denomination. I don't know if it was a student placement or an internship or some other arrangement, but they were talking about the congregations they were serving, and not just talking about, but complaining about, disparaging the people they were supposed to be serving to the point of mockery, because according to the students, the congregation wasn't enlightened enough, not activist enough. They were too stuck in their ways. They just didn't get it. I have no doubt those churches had work to do. What church doesn't? But the conversation I overheard that day was laced with arrogance, it was self-aggrandizing, and it was cruel. And the happy little Jesus bubble that I was in popped. At that point, despite having received a call from Christ, I had only been baptized a year and a half before, and I hardly knew anything about ministry. But I knew enough to recognize that what I was hearing wasn't it. At least not any Christian ministry that I wanted to be part of. On that first day in January 2013, in that first class with Dr. Vogue, I remember clearly the professor saying that when we are looking at the letters of St. Paul, we should always remember that this is vital communication between real people. Yes, the letters contain theology, but they are not theological treatises. They are letters. They are vital communication between real people. They are a pastoral response by Paul to try to address real-world problems that had arisen in the fledgling Christian communities he had started. Paul loves these people. He recognizes they have work to do because what church doesn't, and he is doing his best to help them. His first letter to the church in Corinth is a long one, and in it he addresses a number of issues within the congregation, such as the jockeying of rival groups for control, indifferences to cases of flagrant immorality, the marginalization of the congregation's more disadvantaged members, and this is the specific issue Paul is addressing in our epistle reading this morning. Some members and leaders who feel they are more enlightened about Christian conduct have been disparaging those they deem to be less enlightened, those they think just don't get it. If you recall last week's 1 Corinthians reading, Paul addressed whether it was okay for a Christian to eat meat sacrificed to idols. He established, through references to Scripture and the message of Christ, that people are free to exercise personal privilege and eat and drink whatever they please. But also, he emphatically declares that he himself will not exercise this freedom, not simply as a matter of personal choice, but as a necessity of his allegiance to the gospel. To the self-styled enlightened, he says to the effect, if my eating meat sacrificed to idols will cause others to fail in their faith and start worshiping those idols, I will limit my own freedom and not eat the meat for the sake of others. Paul's greater goal is to bring people into an experience of God's blessing through a message about Christ that brings healing and reconciliation and well-being into their lives. And this is much more important than his own personal privilege or the need to be right. Paul is first and foremost a pastor. And even if we don't agree with everything he has ever written, he is undeniably an exemplar of humble and self-restraining Christian ministry. He meets people where they are. He doesn't judge. He limits his own ego and privilege. And his first instinct is always towards service. As he puts it, I've become all things to all people for the sake of the gospel. Yes, the gospel is liberating in our lives, but it also makes a claim on us. It demands a certain amount of self-limitation, self-control for the sake of others. In a I do what I want world, the gospel is entirely countercultural. It is the exact opposite of arrogance and stands in defiance to all forms of cruelty. According to Paul, every aspect of Christian life, from its structures to its doctrines to the daily practices of faith, must be shaped by the cross of Jesus Christ and his ministry in the shadowed places defined by pain and chaos, sickness and death. Every action of Christ's church, every word uttered in his name must be rooted in Jesus' ministry of self-giving service, his self-sacrifice on behalf of others. Because for Jesus, there was no discrepancy between what he preached and what he practiced. Christian faith claims him as the cosmic figure at the heart of the universe, through whom all things came into being and by whom all things are reconciled. But when you read the Gospels, his is an active, practical, on-the-move, sand-in-the-sandals kind of ministry. And he always starts with the need right in front of him, with the person right in front of him. From our Mark passage today, we read, as soon as they left the synagogue, they entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they took him to her at once. Jesus came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. And then the fever left her, and she began to serve them. Note that this miraculous moment took place not in a holy shrine or an ivory tower, but in an ordinary home. Not for the powerful or privileged or the self-styled enlightened, but for an old woman in a family of fishers. Jesus' ministry responds to human need with good news. And at this moment, in this woman's life, the good news she needs is that of renewed health. This is what Jesus does. He sees the need right in front of him, and he responds. He responds sometimes in healing, sometimes by feeding, sometimes by teaching or accepting or protecting, but always through the giving of himself, always in loving acts of service. Loving response to human need is how the gospel is proclaimed and how it is shared. I understand that we may chafe at the woman in the story being restored to health only to serve the men. There is much to critique about the treatment of women in both ancient and contemporary society, which ought not to be diminished. But there is another way to read this story that I believe is true to the original circumstance and illuminating for us today. In addition to being restored to health, the woman is also restored to dignity. She was restored for purpose. She is the first of a series of women we encounter in Mark's gospel who exemplify self-giving service to Jesus himself. A series of women that also includes the woman with the alabaster jar of costly oil who anoints Jesus right before he is seized. as well as the group of women who bear witness to his crucifixion on the cross and stay in vigil with his broken body, even while the male disciples scatter and panic. Indeed, Simon's mother-in-law is the very first person to demonstrate the proper response to an encounter with the good news of Jesus Christ. The proper response to good news is service. Service, or diakonos in Greek. Simon's mother-in-law was arguably the church's very first deacon. A literal translation of diakonos is to kick up dust. The diaconia is an active, practical, hands and heart, sand in the sandals form of ministry that exists even to this day. This past Monday night, a few of us from Metropolitan attended a meeting of the St. Lawrence Supper Club where the guest speaker was a Catholic deacon by the name of Robert Klinghorn. Every Thursday night for the past 17 years, from 8 p.m. to 1 a.m., Deacon Klinghorn has walked the streets of downtown Toronto, offering a friendly face and a listening ear for the vulnerable and addicted and street-involved people of our city. He told remarkable stories of human tragedy, human connection, and the grace of God being revealed in the places most of us dare not tread. He said the idea to do this came to him after he was traveling home after a late-night church meeting, seeing the need and the suffering on our streets and wondering where was the church at 1 a.m? Where was the church at 1 a.m? And so with prayerful discernment, he decided to answer that question by becoming the church at 1 a.m. Becoming the church by embodying Christ's own ministry of service in the world, by walking the streets and meeting people where they are, meeting people in their places of pain, in their struggles for healing, in their longings for love. As a congregation, we undoubtedly have work to do what church doesn't. But one thing I love about my work here is that I get to be in ministry alongside the people of this church who I see every day living out the Christian faith with humility and dedication and in service to that which is good and beautiful and just. None of us individually can meet all the needs of this world. None of us individually can be all things to all people. And as Christians, we don't need to, because we are part of something bigger. A global movement that, when we are being true to the gospel, embodies the service of Christ in the world. Our challenge is to recognize and live whatever part of Christian ministry each of us is called into, so that we each, as St. Paul says, may become a partner in the gospel. And so individually and collectively, we must keep asking, where is the church at 1 a.m? Where is the church at the bedside of the dying, or in the prison system, or with a single mother whose baby won't stop crying? Where is the church on the migrant boat on the Mediterranean Sea, or on social media, or in camps for refugees? Where is the church in the boardroom, or in the dining room, or in the shelter system with no more room? Where is the church in the blue seats on the TTC, or with working women demanding equality? Where is the church on the assembly line, or the picket line, or with the addict looking for a lifeline? Where is the church with the water walkers, and the flame tenders, and the peacemakers, and the racism breakers? Where is the church with isolated seniors and kids distraught because we're failing as Earth's caretakers? Where is the church at 1 a.m, when it is so easy to disappear into the shadows of our own pain? As he walks the hills of Galilee and the streets of Jerusalem, Jesus sees the need, he sees the pain, and he responds. He responds sometimes by healing, sometimes by feeding, sometimes by teaching or accepting or protecting, but always through the giving of himself, always in loving acts of service. Jesus always starts with the person right in front of him. In Christian ministry, compassion. Compassion is that vital communication between real people this world so desperately needs. Loving response to human need is how the gospel is proclaimed and how it is shared. Friends, let us be partners in the gospel. Let us be partners in the gospel by becoming the church. By becoming the church we need it to be. So mote it be.